May 10th, 1940. It was the day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the day he realised the country was standing on the very edge of oblivion, staring into a darkness deeper than any it had ever known. As Churchill stepped into number 10 Downing Street, France was collapsing, German panzers were charging across Europe like a tidal wave of steel, and the British Expeditionary Force was retreating toward a little French port called Dunkirk, where survival seemed impossible. The British army was beaten, Europe was falling like dominoes, and Hitler's victories were so swift and overwhelming that even seasoned generals whispered privately that the war was already over. Yet the most terrifying question of all hung over Churchill like a storm cloud. Once France fell, which seemed inevitable, how long would Britain last? Hitler commanded the greatest land army on the continent, the most fearsome air force in the world, and a war machine fueled by momentum and myth. The British, by contrast, had only a few hundred fighter planes, a navy stretched thin across the globe, and an island full of civilians who were about to become the front line in a war that no one had expected to reach their homes. And so, on that first night as Prime Minister, Churchill understood he had to prepare Britain for a battle unlike any fought before, a battle not of trenches, but of skies, not for territory, but for survival itself. Little did he know that within just a few months, this very battle would become the moment that would show him, almost against reason, that Britain could still win. But in May 1940, that hope did not yet exist. Britain was alone, and the world expected it to fall. Churchill knew the people needed more than speeches, they needed a miracle. And that miracle, though no one could see it yet, would come from a small, determined, outnumbered group of young men who climbed into the cockpits of Hurricanes and Spitfires and prepared to defend their island against the full might of the Luftwaffe. In those early days, Churchill obsessed over the RAF's fighter strength. He visited airfields in secret, spoke with pilots barely out of their teens, and listened to Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding explain that the entire future of Britain rested on maybe 600 serviceable fighters. Dowding warned him bluntly, "If our fighter defences fail, the war is lost." Churchill never forgot those words, but even as he spoke with commanders and inspected airfields, he knew he had to confront the bleak truth the RAF was untested. Britain's factories were struggling to produce planes fast enough, and morale across Europe was collapsing. Newspapers around the world predicted Britain would negotiate with Hitler within weeks. In private, even some British politicians whispered about peace. Churchill refused. He had no intention of surrendering, but belief alone could not stop German bombers. Everything depended on the pilots he called the few, the handful of young fighters who would carry the weight of a nation on their shoulders. And as June arrived and France fell, Churchill watched in grim silence as British ships carried home beaten soldiers from Dunkirk, soldiers alive only because of extraordinary courage, luck, and a miracle he didn't dare count on happening again. France surrendered on June 22nd. Hitler turned his gaze directly toward Britain. And on June 30th, Churchill learned that the Luftwaffe was preparing the largest air assault the world had ever seen, an aerial hammer designed to smash Britain's defences, destroy the RAF, and clear the skies for a full-scale invasion, Operation Sea Lion. This was it. Everything Britain had, everything it was, everything it would ever be, now depended on a fight in the summer sky. Churchill felt the weight of history crushing down on him. If Britain fell, the world would fall. And yet, even as the danger grew, he began to sense something else, a spark. Something he didn't fully understand yet, something waiting in the wings. It started with the RAF's discipline, the precision of their radar network, the courage of their pilots, the calm determination he saw in airfields across the country. Many of these pilots were children of farmers, shopkeepers, clerks, ordinary young men who smoked cigarettes, joked with mechanics, and climbed into Spitfires knowing they might not live to see another sunset. They were not afraid of Hitler, they were afraid only of failing. Churchill sensed something rising inside them, a fire he had not felt in France, a stubborn spirit that reminded him of the old stories of English longbowmen at Agincourt, or the Royal Navy at Trafalgar. These were young men ready to defend their island to the last, and in their eyes, Churchill began to glimpse the possibility, just the faintest, that Britain could still fight back. The Battle of Britain had not yet begun, but the stage was set. Radar towers blinked along the coast. Pilots slept in their uniforms beside their planes. Mechanics worked around the clock under dimmed lights. Luftwaffe bombers were massing in France, and in the centre of it all stood Churchill, the new Prime Minister of a nation alone, waiting for a storm that would strike with a fury unparalleled in history, a storm that would either crush Britain forever or ignite the moment he would never forget. the moment he would realise that despite everything, the country could still win. July 10th, 1940. On this warm summer morning, the thunder of engines rolled across the English Channel as the Battle of Britain officially began, and Churchill, standing in the Cabinet war rooms beneath London, felt the weight of a nation in every distant echo. The situation was desperate, and everyone knew it. Hitler now controlled France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Norway. His army stood on the coast staring across the water toward the last free nation in Western Europe. If the Luftwaffe could crush the RAF, the German invasion fleet already gathering in French ports would launch across the Channel. Britain's fate now hung on the wings of a few hundred fighters. That morning, the Luftwaffe-S first coordinated attacks hit convoys in the Channel, probing British defences, testing radar response times, pushing the RAF into the air to see how quickly they reacted. To the Germans, it was just the beginning. To Churchill, it was the first tremor before the earthquake, and as he listened to the reports come in, pilots engaging, radar stations tracking raids, fighters scrambling, he sensed the fragile balance on which everything rested. He felt a knot in his stomach tighten, because he knew if the RAF failed even once in a spectacular way, if German bombers broke through and destroyed key airfields or radar stations, Britain would be defenceless. But what struck him that first week wasn't a fear, it was determination. The young pilots were not only holding their own, they were fighting with a ferocity that exceeded all expectations. Fighter Command S leader, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, had been proved right. His radar network was giving the RAF just enough warning to get planes into the air in time. Churchill visited Fighter Command's headquarters at Uxbridge on July 16th, watching as Dowding and Keith Park orchestrated the defence like chess masters. As the plotting table marked incoming raids, Churchill watched yellow, red and black markers slide across the map like shadows approaching the heart of the nation. And then he saw something that stunned him. The calm professionalism of the RAF controllers, the precision of their decisions, the discipline of the pilots responding instantly to orders. There was no panic, no chaos. Britain was under attack by the most powerful air force on earth, and yet there was order, structure, confidence. It was the first moment Churchill felt flickers of hope hardening into something stronger. But hope was fragile. For every German bomber shot down, the RAF lost irreplaceable pilots. Churchill visited airfields across southern England, Biggin Hill, Tangmere, hawkingly greeted by young men with oil-stained faces, half-empty mugs of tea, and uniforms still smelling of engine smoke. Many were just boys, 19, 20, 21. They laughed, smoked, joked like carefree friends at a pub, and then scrambled into the sky with hearts pounding, knowing that today could be their last. Churchill spoke with them, encouraged them, asked how they were holding up. They answered with quiet confidence, but he could see the exhaustion behind their smiles. Some hadn't slept more than 4 hours in days, some barely 8. Mechanics worked until their fingers blistered, replacing engines, patching holes, changing tyres, fueling planes in the dark, sometimes while bombs fell around them. And yet, despite the pressure, Churchill heard no complaints, only determination. It moved him deeply. After one visit, he sat in the back of his car, tears filling his eyes, and whispered, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He hadn't yet spoken those words publicly, but they formed inside him because of what he saw with his own eyes. Throughout July and early August, the Luftwaffe intensified its attacks. Convoys burned in the Channel, ports were bombed, radar towers were targeted, fighter airfields endured relentless strikes. But the RAF held. Churchill followed every day's results. Every German raid intercepted, every squadron scrambled, every plane lost, every pilot killed. Britain survived each day by inches, and yet it survived. By August 1st, Hitler issued Directive No. 17, ordering the Luftwaffe to destroy the RAF to prepare for invasion. August 13th, Eagle Day, became one of the fiercest days of combat in aviation history. Churchill woke early, sensing the magnitude of the coming assault. Radar screens lit up. Controllers shouted orders. The Luftwaffe launched over 1,500 aircraft, sending waves of bombers and escorting fighters roaring toward Britain. Churchill spent the day travelling between operations rooms, watching battles unfold in real time. At Uxbridge, he saw the plotting table fill with markers until the entire southern coast looked like it was being swallowed by red discs, enemy formations everywhere. RAF fighters climbed to meet them, but they were outnumbered many times over. Churchill's heart pounded as he watched squadrons scramble, knowing that some of the faces he had seen at breakfast would not return by lunch. Reports flowed in. 1 enemy bomber down. 2 fighters lost. Biggin Hill hit hard. Tangmere heavily damaged, Hawkinge under attack. Fires raged across the south. Airfields were cratered. Fuel stores exploded. Churchill watched it all, gripping his cane so tightly his knuckles turned white. But as the long, brutal day dragged on, something became unmistakably clear. Despite the intensity of the attack, despite the overwhelming numbers, the RAF had not broken. Outnumbered, outpaced, exhausted, they still rose to fight. Again and again, they intercepted raids, shot down bombers, and disrupted formations. Dowding's system worked. Parker's tactics worked. The Spitfire and Hurricane pilots worked. And as the sun set on Eagle Day, Churchill, who had arrived at Uxbridge fearing disaster, departed with a realization burning in his chest. They can hold. Not easily. Not without great sacrifice. But they could hold the line. On August 15th, Luftwaffe High Command attempted to overwhelm the RAF from every direction at once, launching raids from Norway and France simultaneously. Yet the RAF repelled them again. It was on this day that Churchill understood something profound. Hitler had expected Britain to collapse quickly, but the RAF had confounded him. The Prime Minister saw the first cracks in Nazi invincibility. He sensed the shift in momentum. Even as cities burned and pilots died, even as fighter command teetered on the edge, something incorruptible surged through the British spirit. Churchill felt it everywhere, in the confident voices of controllers, in the steady hands of mechanics, in the courage of teenagers flying into fire. Britain was not breaking, it was hardening. Hitler had assumed superiority in numbers and aircraft would win quickly. But the Battle of Britain was not a contest of machines. It was a contest of will, a contest of resilience. And in this battlefield of endurance, Churchill realized Britain had something Germany lacked, a nation united in survival, a cause purer than conquest, a people willing to fight not for expansion, but for home. By late August, the Luftwaffe shifted to targeting airfields more aggressively, and the pressure reached its peak. Some airfields were hit repeatedly. Pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Planes were patched together and sent back into combat with bullet holes still in their wings. Churchill visited Dowding again, sensing the strain in his voice. Britain was close to breaking, but not yet broken, and then came an event that transformed the entire war. On the night of August 24th, a German bomber accidentally dropped bombs on London. In retaliation, Churchill ordered the RAF to bomb Berlin. Hitler, enraged, shifted his entire strategy and ordered the Luftwaffe to begin bombing London instead of Fighter Command S airfields. It was a colossal strategic mistake, and Churchill knew it the moment he heard the news. For the first time in the war, he allowed himself to feel something dangerous: confidence. The enemy had blinked. The moment Britain needed had arrived not from luck, not from hope, but from the courage of those fighting in the sky. The Battle of Britain was turning. Churchill felt it, and in the depths of his heart he whispered the words he had long held back. We shall win. September the 7th, 1940. The sun was setting over London when the sky began to roar, not with the sound of a few scattered bombers, but with the deafening thunder of hundreds of engines, the first massive German air raid on the capital. Churchill stood on the roof of the Air Ministry watching as the Luftwaffe unleashed a storm of fire upon the city, and though the sight filled him with sorrow, a different, deeper realization began to form inside him. This terrible new phase of the battle, the Blitz, might paradoxically be the moment the RAF needed to survive, and the moment Britain would prove it could endure anything. The Luftwaffe S shift to bombing cities instead of airfields was a disastrous miscalculation, but it also plunged Britain into a nightmare. Churchill watched London burn from the rooftop St Paul's Cathedral, silhouetted by flames, docks exploding like volcanoes, warehouses collapsing under the assault. Even from miles away the heat could be felt, and the glow turned the night sky blood red. Firefighters fought until their arms gave out. Civilians fled through smoke-choked streets, carrying children and whatever belongings they could salvage. Churchill's heart ached. These were his people suffering for a strategic misstep he had provoked by bombing Berlin. Yet amid the devastation, among the screaming sirens and falling debris, he saw something extraordinary. Londoners were not breaking. They were standing. They were fighting back not with guns or planes, but with courage, stubbornness and resilience that neither bomb nor fire could extinguish. Air raid wardens guided families into shelters. Firemen dove into collapsing buildings to save strangers. Nurses treated injuries by lantern light. Civilians sang in subway stations as bombs fell overhead. And when Churchill toured the shelters, mothers and children stood to shake his hand, offering him smiles they barely had strength left to give. "We can take it," one woman said. lifting her chin proudly, and Churchill believed her. That same night, while fires raged across London, something else happened that would change everything. For the first time in weeks, Britain's airfields were spared. Fighter Command took the opportunity to repair runways, replace equipment, and bring damaged Spitfires and Hurricanes back to life. Dowding and Park understood instantly what this meant. The Luftwaffe-S mistake had given the RAF room to breathe. Churchill felt the shift too. The pilots, exhausted and battered, finally had a chance to regroup. Mechanics repaired aircraft that had been sitting like broken birds. Radar operators caught their breath. Controllers could plan with clarity instead of scrambling blindly. It was a small window of hope, but in a battle of inches it was enough. Over the next few days, the Luftwaffe doubled down on its new strategy, convinced that bombing London would break British morale. But it only hardened it. Churchill walked through streets still glowing with embers, meeting survivors who stood in front of the ruins of their homes, declaring they would not leave, would not surrender, would not fear. Their defiance moved him more deeply than any military report. He realized then that this war would not be decided by numbers or bombs, it would be decided by the spirit of ordinary men and women, and that spirit was unbreakable. Meanwhile, in the skies above, the RAF was coming back to life. Pilots flew sortie after sortie, intercepting bombers before they reached the city. Spitfires sliced through the air like silver blades. Hurricanes smashed into bomber formations with deadly precision. Many pilots knew they had only minutes to live, yet they climbed into their cockpits every morning with fierce pride. Churchill visited them again and again, sometimes arriving unannounced, watching as they prepared to scramble. He saw the camaraderie, the laughter, the fear hidden behind confident smirks. He saw pilots who had lost friends the day before climb into planes still stained with oil and soot, determined to take the fight back to the enemy. And he saw something else, something that told him Britain could still win. The Luftwaffe was starting to falter. German pilots were exhausted. They had flown hundreds of miles from bases in France, while RAF fighters operated from nearby airfields. British radar detected raids long before they arrived, giving the RAF precious minutes to intercept. Dowding S system was working like a vast, coordinated machine, one Hitler had never understood. And Churchill knew this was the hinge moment of the war, this was when the tide could turn. That realization crystallized on September 15, 1940, a day Churchill would remember for the rest of his life. He travelled to Fighter Command headquarters, descending into the underground operations room where the fate of Britain would soon be decided. The plotting table filled with markers as the largest raid yet approached, hundreds of bombers and fighters sweeping across the Channel. Churchill stood silently behind Keith Park, watching as the orders were issued with calm precision. Then, the moment came, scramble the squadrons. RAF fighters roared into the air, the battle unfolded in real time on the plotting table, coloured markers shifting, colliding, disappearing. Churchill could hear the tension in every voice the controllers directing fighters, the radio squawk of pilots calling for support, the clipped urgency of Dowding S orders. Then these messages began to flow in from pilots in the sky. Tally-ho! Engaging enemy bombers! Splash 1 Heinkel! Taking fire, we need reinforcements! The battle was ferocious, chaotic, and deadly. Bombers broke formation under relentless attacks. Spitfires duelled Messerschmitts in twisting spirals. Hurricanes tore into bomber wings. Churchill gripped the railing, his heart pounding. He understood that this was it, the day Hitler expected the RAF to collapse. But instead, he saw something miraculous unfold. The RAF was not breaking. It was rising. Pilots launched themselves into hopeless odds with reckless bravery. Squadrons low on fuel refused to return to base until every bomber had turned back. Ground crews worked frantically to rearm planes the moment they landed, shouting encouragement to pilots climbing back into cockpits still steaming with heat. And then it happened the moment Churchill would never forget. German bombers began to retreat. Fighter Command had thrown everything into the air and it had worked. The Luftwaffe was beaten off. The sky, once filled with enemy aircraft, began to clear. Churchill looked at the plotting table, seeing the German markers pulling back across the Channel, and felt a surge of emotion so overwhelming he had to look away. For the first time since the war began, he felt not just hope, but certainty. Britain could win. Britain would win. The impossible had happened. The Luftwaffe had been defeated in open combat. The unbreakable force that had crushed Europe had been stopped by a small island nation refusing to bow. Churchill left the operations room shaken, moved, inspired. As he climbed the stairs back to the surface, He whispered words meant for no one but himself. "This is the end of the beginning." That evening he reported to Parliament that the day had been one of the most significant of the war. Privately he knew its full meaning. Hitler's invasion was now impossible. The RAF had ensured the survival of Britain. Everything Churchill had feared when he first took office, the collapse of Europe, the threat of invasion, the looming shadow of Nazi domination had been met head-on by a few hundred pilots and turned back. The realization broke the darkness surrounding him since May. The battle was not over, but Britain had proved something the world desperately needed to believe. Nazi Germany could be beaten, and in the smoky evening air as the fires of London slowly burned out, Churchill felt something he had not felt. Since the war began, victory was no longer unthinkable. It was inevitable. October 31st, 1940. The final day of the Battle of Britain arrived not with the roar of 1,000 engines, but with the uneasy quiet that settles when a storm realizes it has lost its power. And Churchill, standing at his bedroom window in the early morning light, understood instinctively that something irreversible had changed. The Luftwaffe had not disappeared completely. There were still raids at night, still the dreaded whistle of falling bombs, still the distant tremble of London's fire brigades rushing toward new infernos, but the great daytime assaults, the waves of bombers that once blotted out the sky, were gone. Hitler, frustrated beyond measure, had shifted his strategy away from destroying the RAF and toward a long bombing campaign intended to break civilian morale. But it was too late. The decisive moment had passed. The RAF still flew. Fighter command still stood. The invasion barges that had been assembled in French ports were quietly dispersed. And for the first time since Churchill took office, Britain was no longer fighting simply to survive another day. It was now fighting from a position of strength, carrying the confidence of a nation that had faced annihilation and refused to yield. Churchill walked through London's battered streets that afternoon, his hat pulled low, his cane tapping steadily across broken glass and soot-covered pavement. Children chased one another between the ruins as if the war were only a distant rumour. Women hung laundry between collapsed buildings, turning rubble into makeshift villages. Firefighters napped in doorways, helmets beside them, ready to spring into action the moment the sirens wailed again. London was wounded, scarred, bruised but alive, and as Churchill moved through the city, heads turned, people smiled. Someone called, "We were still here, Winston." He raised his fingers in the V for victory and the crowd erupted in cheers. The city was a symbol of everything the RAF had fought for, a people who would not bow, who had discovered in themselves a depth of courage they never knew they possessed. Yet Churchill knew the full triumph of the Battle of Britain did not lie in these streets, nor even in the skies above. It lay underground in the operations rooms where Dowding and Park had coordinated the defence with mechanical precision, in the radar stations along the coast that had given Britain precious minutes to prepare, in the factories where men and women built Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them, in the training centres where new pilots, some barely old enough to shave, learned to fly with lethal efficiency, in the quiet determination of a nation that had decided it would rather burn than bend. And above all, the triumph lay in the handful of fighter pilots whose bravery had outshone the darkest storm Europe had ever known. Churchill returned to Biggin Hill, one of the airfields hardest hit during the battle. He walked among the revetments where Spitfires were parked, their wings patched, their engines still warm from patrol. Pilots lounged on the grass, drinking tea and joking, their faces tired but proud. Mechanics, their hands covered in grease, worked silently on a Hurricane whose fuselage looked like it had been stitched back together after being torn apart. Everywhere Churchill looked, he saw the cost of victory. Empty chairs in briefing rooms, photos of fallen pilots pinned to walls, bunks that would never again be slept in, pieces of wreckage carefully stored as reminders of the friends who had not returned. He spoke with the squadron leaders, listened as they recounted the fiercest days, the moments when they'd been outnumbered 10-1, the times when their fuel gauges had been on empty and their ammunition spent, yet they stayed in the fight because there was no alternative. One young pilot, barely 20, told Churchill, "We just kept going, sir. We couldn't let them through." His voice cracked as he spoke. Churchill placed a hand on his shoulder, overwhelmed by the weight of what these boys had done. Later, as Churchill watched a Spitfire take off, its Merlin engine singing that beautiful, fierce sound that became the anthem of the entire battle, he felt a swell of emotion unlike anything he had known before. Admiration, grief, pride, gratitude, all woven into one. He realized that the Battle of Britain was not a military campaign, it was a miracle wrought by human will. But the victory had been far from certain. Churchill knew how close Britain had come to defeat. He remembered those harrowing days in August, when airfields were burning and pilots were falling faster than they could be trained. He remembered the classified reports warning that only a few more days of pressure could break fighter command entirely. He remembered the fog of uncertainty, the gnawing fear that every decision he made might be the one that tipped the balance toward disaster. But every time he had visited an airfield, every time he had seen a Spitfire soaring into combat with the grace of a predator and the courage of a martyr, he had felt something in his chest ignite a quiet certainty that Britain possessed a strength the enemy could not measure, because it came not from strategy or steel, but from the character of the people themselves. And now, standing on the edge of an airfield still littered with debris, Churchill understood the true meaning of what had been achieved. The Luftwaffe had not merely been repelled, it had been defeated in the first major battle fought entirely in the air. Hitler's aura of invincibility had been shattered. The German war machine, which had crushed 6 nations in 6 weeks, had been stopped cold by a country standing alone, and the rest of the world was watching. In Washington, newspaper headlines declared Britain's victory a turning point. In occupied Europe, whispers spread through underground networks. Britain fights on. In Germany, for the first time, Hitler's generals dared to question his judgment. The Battle of Britain was more than a military victory. It was a psychological earthquake. By winning, Britain had given hope to the world and sent a message to every occupied nation that the Nazi Empire was not unstoppable. Churchill knew what this meant for the future. With Britain still in the fight, the possibility of American support grew stronger. The potential for a united Allied front emerged. The dream of liberating Europe flickered in the distance, faint but real. And above all, Churchill realized that winning this battle had given Britain something it desperately needed. Time. Time to rebuild. Time to man the factories. Time to strengthen defences. Time to gather allies. Time to prepare for the long war ahead. Without the RAF, without the few, there would have been no time, only surrender. That night, Churchill returned to London, where the glow of fires still smudged the sky. He walked into the cabinet war rooms, removed his hat and sat heavily in his chair. Advisors brought him casualty reports, intelligence summaries, strategic forecasts. He read them all in silence. Then he stood, walked to a map of Europe, and stared at the vast expanse of Nazi-controlled territory. It still dwarfed the British Isles. The enemy was still powerful, still ruthless, still terrifying. But for the first time in the war, Churchill did not feel fear. He felt resolve, he felt certainty, he felt destiny. Because Britain had done something extraordinary. It had survived, it had fought the greatest air force in the world, it had stood alone, and it had won. In the morning, Churchill visited the House of Commons to deliver the speech he had been composing in his heart since the battle began. His voice carried through Parliament, firm, unyielding, filled with pride. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, and as the words echoed through the chamber, Churchill knew they were not just a tribute, they were a prophecy. The few had saved Britain, and in doing so, they had saved the future. The war was far from over. Dark days lay ahead. The Blitz would continue. Hardship would test every family, every neighbourhood, every town. But the greatest question of all, the question that had haunted Churchill since May, had finally been answered. Could Britain still win? The Battle of Britain had given him the truth. Yes, absolutely yes. And with that truth burning in his chest like a second heartbeat, Churchill turned back to the work of war, no longer fighting to avoid defeat, but to secure victory. The road would be long, the sacrifices immense, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Britain would fight on. Britain would endure. Britain would win.